Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA event, Revisiting Retrofits, Building Typologies for the Office, which is part of the NLA Conservation and Heritage Programme. My name is Benjamin O'Connor, and I'm a director here at New London Architecture. Since the very first office buildings were built back in the 18th century, our working patterns and ideas on what workspaces should be have dramatically shifted. It is a testament to the building stock that London has that many of these historic buildings still stand today. London has always been an adaptive and resilient city, and we have learned to make our buildings work better for us whilst addressing pressing concerns of the time, such as the climate emergency. In today's webinar, we will look at exemplar office retrofits that highlight ways we can adapt our buildings, making them fit for the future. Before we start, I would like to thank our programme supporters Purcell and remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end of the event, so please do ask those throughout using the Zoom Q&A function. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Seth Rutt, who's partner and residential sector lead at Hawkins Brown.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to present here at the NLA. If we go on to the next slide and the next one, please. I'm a partner at Hawkins Brown. I ostensibly lead the residential team, but I do all sorts of projects. And when the opportunity came up to do a workplace building, naturally, myself and my colleagues leapt at the chance to change genres, really. So I'm sort of slightly coming from outside the sector in many ways. If we go to the next slide, please, Ben. So I'm going to talk to you about a deep retrofit and extension of a late Victorian, early Edwardian building, right bang in the middle between Waterloo and London Bridge, just in Southwark. Probably the going rate for rent around here is probably about 75 quid a foot, sometimes half that, sometimes a bit more. And obviously for grade A office space, that's sort of newly refurbished, we're probably into the 75 quid a foot mark and sometimes more. And this project was perhaps about getting more than the sum of its parts. If we go to the next slide, here we are. This is Great Suffolk Street. The pre-existing building is on the left. Apocryphally, it was once a bacon factory, but through historic mapping, we think it's sort of about turn of the century, but it's a typical sort of functional industrial building, which despite that still had a lot of personality and soul about it. It was on 3 floors, had about 21,000 square feet, and had a sort of half of it was a single level building. And the project was to demolish the single level building, and we doubled them, we mirrored the existing massing sensitively. And this photo doesn't show it, but actually we got a whole extra 3rd floor on top, so it was a 4-story building. So if we go to the next slide, this shows you the existing floor plans. It's about 21,000 square feet. It had 1 lift, a rickety staircase, not very nice common parts, well lit though, nice narrow floor plate. And a sort of a ground floor that was used for storage and warehousing. So if we go to the next one, the next slide sort of shows you how to actually deal with the challenges of retrofitting this building. We actually built a whole new core with 2 lifts, a good toilet provision, and a feature staircase in a glazed lift shaft. So, there was a bit of investment there on the behalf of our client, Morgan Capital Partners, who bought this building from Threadneedle. So we did the planning for Threadneedle, and then Alex Morgan and his team and Morgan Capital Partners bought the building and were kind enough to take on Hawkins Brown and the original design team for the sort of completion service. But in some ways, you can see here that building a new core just enabled us to not have to compromise too much on structure. And it made the sort of demolition and reinsertion of floor plates in the existing building that much easier. Next slide, please. So this section shows almost the very front bay of the building, and it pretty much mirrors the existing section. But in the background, you can see how we've squeezed this whole additional floor in through a dormer, and then there's a roof terrace at the back as well, which is accessed through a pavilion with plant in the background. Next slide, please. And this is the building from the street. Just going to talk about materials here, really. We deliberately didn't quite match the existing brick of the building, which is in a London stock, but it's actually the existing building has been, much adjusted and refurbished over the years. And you can see almost like the scars of sequential amendments to the building and strengthening, etc. And we made a conscious effort not to clean the existing building too much, and actually allow the new brickwork just above the widened windows there on the right-hand side to be sort of visible. So the building sort of bears its sort of history, really. We reglazed the entire building, so almost this sort of rhythmic series of vertical mullions, almost echoes the original crystal windows, but with a higher performance glazing. And that sort of stitches the new building into the old building. And interestingly enough, we got planning under delegated powers without any conditions. So we rang up Michael Sakaris at Southwark when we came to start on site. And we got a load of brick samples out on the street. So we were actually there with Michael on the street selecting bricks. And I'd like to sort of, credit Michael really with having a hand in this building as well. And you can see we chose this lovely sort of salt glazed brick, which reflects the light. And the whole intention was to have an aged quality to extending this existing building. So although it's new brick, it still has this lovely random bond with all sorts of sort of burnt bits. And one of our project architects, Edmund, had to go ferreting in the skip because the bricklayers were chucking out all the interesting bricks and sort of get them back in the building. The tiles are sort of Turkish terrazzo tiles from Stoke Newington. And so there's this sort of layered sort of Victorian quality to the building. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, sorry, in the previous slide, you can see how we sneaked that dormer window in. So that's an entire floor in the top of the building, but it doesn't really impact the streetscape. Sorry, next slide, please. And so this is the existing building. It was a concrete encased steel structure, and you can see how the windows go up to the ceiling. So if you're already thinking about how we're going to ventilate this building and put the sort of modern grade A servicing into the building, you can see that we were presented with a bit of a challenge and that the services would be very much on view to the street. And then on the right hand side image, you can see the sort of top floor, the original second floor of the building, and the roof structure before we put in this new dormer. So next slide, please. So on the right hand side, you can see how we've put in the new dormer floor, and that's just temporary bracing there, which was removed. And then in the middle, you can see how the engineers, Samueli and partners, exploited this steel structure behind the concrete and actually managed to cut voids so that the MEP engineers, Watkins Payne, could thread these air ducts through the structure. We're challenged here because the original floor to floor heights were less than 4 meters, which is almost a typical floor to floor height in modern office buildings. And so, it's not super low, but we were absolutely trying to squeeze the pips, so having to work through the structure was important. And on the left side, we had to dig a basement, which again was a challenge because we're close to the River Thames here, and we were just brushing the water line here. So Iconic, the contractors, did a really good job on this. Next slide, please. And I also want to, the theme of this actually is that I think this building had good voodoo, this project, because actually everyone in the team, and that's client, contractor, agents, design team, all came together in a spirit of mutual respect. And so I want to credit Charlie Killen here of Edward Charles and Partners, who just had this, he was marketing buildings to the TMT sector at the time, and was really sort of suggesting to both us and the client that actually, if we could get visual interconnectivity between the floors with this new feature staircase, actually that would promote vertical circulation through the building and deal with this fairly small floor plate, and actually enable the tenancies to sort of interconnect a bit, or a tenant to take 2 floors and still feel they had sort of ownership across the floors. So I credit Charlie with sort of spearheading this, because what he was able to do was demonstrate to the client that actually all this fire-rated glazing up 4 floors and this expensive staircase was actually worth its money and would wash its own face. And actually, as I understand it, that actually helped contribute to sort of a 20 quid surplus per square foot on the going rental rate. So, I should be talking about design, not money, but I think, the money makes the architecture. So I'll go into the materials on the next slide, I think. So the staircase descends all the way down to the bottom of the building with a little bit of a flourish. And what it does, by opening it out to the ground floor, it sort of invites this upward physical circulation through the building. And so, there's 2 lifts there, but actually we find that a lot of the tenants just use the staircase. So the the interiors, obviously we're dealing with shell space, which is very simple, but the circulation space has this sort of dark brooding quality. And it's really in tune, it's getting into tune with the original Victorian building. And so we have waxed steel, bronze, and also lots of copper alloys in the bits that you actually touch, so the brass handrail and the bronze door hardware. And that copper in the alloys actually has an antimicrobial quality. So one might say this is slightly prescient sort of specification given our current status and how conscious we are of microbes in buildings. And then Edmund, the project architect, selected a lovely Venetian glass chandelier that drops all the way through the staircase. Next slide, please. And that's the chandelier there on the right, making use of that lovely void that goes down. That's void's top lit from a lantern on the roof. And then the lues are a sort of moment of brightness. And the tiles on the floor are from the same manufacturer in Northeast London who made the tiles for the facade. So it links inside and out. Next slide, please. MCP, really invested in kind of cladding the services with stainless steel, etc., to, make sure that they would be visually acceptable on view. And I think one thing I'd like to say about this is there was a real challenge with this building, squeezing this top floor in, because we had a plant room on top of this, and you can sort of see these big V beams with display on in the middle and the right of the image. That soffit height is about 2.4 meters. Well, the old sort of BCO sort of best practice, I guess, would be to have a finished height of more than 2.7. And so we were squeezing the pips out of this space. So Samuele had this interesting sort of semi-cantilevered beam here but what we managed to do was actually get a visual sight to the 2.9 soffit height of the metal decking above. And you can see how we've color-coded structure and surfaces. What we did, and what MCP paid for, was a series of mock-up bays, and I think that was invaluable to the success of the project. And also, because of this separation between MEP engineers and, well, not a separation, but there's a distinct sort of split when the MEP engineers work designs up conceptually, but then hand over to the MEP subcontractor earlier than perhaps the architects do. You get this kind of conceptual level of employers' requirements, but then the detail comes after, and sometimes it's very hard to coordinate. So what Hawkins Brown did here is we actually redrew all the MEP on a single coordinated services sort of reflected ceiling plan, and we really had to do that. So there is a cost in design in doing this, but we think it was worth it. Next slide, please. Really, essentially, we had a robust interior of brick, anticipating that the interiors would be refitted out 3 times over during the life of the building. So no plasterboard. Next slide, please. And MCP always put a roof terrace and access to outdoor space in their buildings. So, again, that's in chime with what we want to do now. Next slide, please. And then a final word, really, just to say that Architecture 00 came in with their client, GP Johnson, and they really got into the spirit of the building. And so I kind of see it as not just a shell and core and then tenant fit out process, but as a collaboration. So I think in summary, this project had good voodoo because everyone was in tune with one another and worked in a spirit of mutual respect. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Seth. Sorry, I had to cut you off there. I like the good voodoo, so hopefully we'll see that in some of the other projects we're going to see today. For those of you that have just joined, please do remember you can ask questions throughout to any of our speakers, and we'll try and leave some time at the end to ask those questions. Okay, our next speaker is Valentina Galmozzi, who is director at AKT2. Valentina, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, next please. Good morning, everyone. I'm Valentina Galmozzi, Design Director in AKT2, Structural Engineers, and I'm delighted to be here today to discuss revisiting retrofit. Next, please. AKT for the last 25 years has been really active in the renovation sector. We've been working on some iconic historical buildings in the UK, from the reinvention of the Islington Flax Mill, the very first cast iron building in the world, to the prestigious Maritime Museum in London. At the moment, we are involved in the regeneration of Smithfield Markets buildings to have the new Museum of London. So pretty exciting. Next. When working with existing building, the key challenges are always about the existing fabric, how it was conceived originally and how we can adapt it to new requirements. Also, it is very rare that a building hasn't actually undergone already some alteration. Generally, new lifts, new services are being fit in, basically to keep up with the modern requirement. So it is never a pure structure. Next. And Frederick Place is a clear example of exactly that. A medley of listed and not listed buildings in the very heart of London, not far from St. Paul and very well connected to the rest of the city. An in-depth desktop study is really important to understand the history and the context of the site that we are going to modify. Next, please. Historically, the strong presence of Gardol and the Corporation of London made the area very attractive for livery companies, and the merchant company, which was basically our client, established the hall in Frederick Place during the 15th and the 16th century. Frederick Place is one of the very few surviving examples of speculative buildings in the city, and it was designed by the famous Adam brothers, so a lot of heritage there. The original Merchant Hall was destroyed by the Great Fire in 1666, and it was reopened 10 years later. Not much luck, unfortunately, because the Merchant Hall and one Frederick Place were also badly damaged during the Blitz in May 1941. Both buildings were rebuilt in the late 50s. Merchant Hall is now known as Beckett House. Next, please. As previously mentioned, the site is in the very heart of London within the Guildhall Conservation Area, and it is surrounded by an area of listed buildings. Within the site, number 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8, Frederick Place and 35 Hall Drury are listed building, grade 2. Next, please. Here are some images of the site with some snapshot from internal and externals. We can see 1 and 3 Frederick Place on the right, and on the left we got 7 and 8. And at the very hand of the snapshot, you will see 4A and 4B. Those are the only 2 buildings that would be actually demolished as part of the new development. Next, please. Now, investigating the existing fabric is easier said than done, really. Easy when strip out has already happened and the existing structure has been exposed. Walking around the site is a very first step to gather information. Twinned with existing and historical information, you can start assessing when initial modification is taking place. Next, please. You can also review the existing condition, which does actually help to tailor the intrusive fabric survey that we'll have to follow. When strip out does not happen, for example, when we have area with heritage finishes like plasterboard or features, it is slightly less straightforward, but it can still be achievable thanks to, next, historical archive drawings. This is another important asset that we need to interrogate very carefully. Unfortunately, not always we have very original drawings. However, we can still gather important information from later alteration. Next. Those drawings showing the intervention done in the late 70s on 7 and 8 Frederick Place with a new lift installed to keep up with the modern times, really. Next. So far, visual inspections and archive drawings have helped to gather helpful information, but ultimately, we need an extensive fabric survey in order to proceed. Foundation, floor, columns, walls, material testing, and so forth are all required for us to own the existing structure and be comfortable that the proposed alteration work. Next. Although those buildings were a few surviving examples of early speculative offices dated back in the 1800s, that does not mean that the requirements are the same as today. Today's building regs, for example, require enhanced thermal and comfort performances, which is often very difficult to translate into existing fabric, and similarly with robustness requirements. Next. I like to bring up the historical codes because they are of paramount importance when it comes to historical buildings. Whether they've been followed at the time is a little bit of a mystery. We've found in our experience that is often a little bit of a hit and miss. Interestingly, the appraisal of existing iron and steel structures code stated that many structures, historical structures, were not consciously conceived in terms of resisting to lateral loads. So generally, justifying existing structure for lateral stability is often quite a challenge. Next. So the nature of the intervention on those buildings are relatively limited to internal upgrades and tailored interventions. We couldn't go higher due to the existing massing protected views of the surrounding. Building extension is a trend. Is always worth exploring, especially if you want to gain additional area. However, it is very much dependent on the surrounding context. In Clapham Junction, for example, we are proposing a 2-story extension on top of a grade 2 listed building because we are allowed to in that particular context. John Robertson Architects led the refurbishment and the restoration of the properties around Frederick Place. We brought the existing building back into commercial use for modern city occupiers while respecting the historical and the conservation constraints of the local area. A new coffee shop and a restaurant has been proposed in 1-3 Frederick Place, which involved partial demolition of the existing ground floor. You can see here a couple of options that we will put forward for the strengthening of that particular floor. Next. The rest of the intervention revolved around new accessible terraces at higher levels and the higher end specs offices. New risers were installed along with new plant enclosures in the roof. Following a load balance principles, we didn't need to do any strengthening on the foundation, and that's generally one of the key when we are looking at historical buildings. We've mended the existing fabric where it was a little bit tired, and we've upgraded the existing fabric where necessary to enhance durability and robustness. For example, we replaced all the timber lintels which were embedded into the external walls to avoid the issue of rot in the long term as a consequence of moisture ingress. So all in all, an extremely interesting project in a fantastic setting, and it's been a really successful project as well, and a really good fun to work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Okay, our next presenter today is James Ennis, who's Project Director at Grosvenor. James.
Hi, thank you, Ben. That's right. Well, hi, good morning, everyone. My name is, as Ben says, is James Ennis. I lead the PM team that deliver projects on Grosvenor's London estate. Now, the project I'm going to talk through this morning is not the largest, it's not the most glamorous project in the portfolio, but I think it is the most exciting in terms of what you can do with a dated building if you really put your mind to it. So next slide, please. So this is 7 Holbein Place, and as you can see, a pretty ordinary dated 1980s office building. It's dominated by the dark brickwork, the dark windows, no presence around where the reception is, and it's got this strange sort of robot head feature up at roof level. So it's definitely an ugly duckling on our portfolio. The next slide just shows where Holbein Place is, which is just off Sloane Square, right next to the Tube. The map to the right shows the extent of our Belgravia estate, which is Hyde Park to the north, Victoria to the east, and Sloane Square down in the southeast corner. Next slide, please. Yeah, I mean, this is just another shot of the elevation, just to sort of drum home how bad it really is. And the next slide is a shot of the reception. Nothing special there. Next slide is a typical office floor, which has low floor to ceiling heights, no raised floors, typical 1980s, but just gives you an idea as to the sort of dated nature of the building. On the next slide, on a positive note, there are some great views across London from the roof, which I'll come to shortly. And then on to the brief, which is the next slide. I mean, this project kicked off in late 2019, which coincided with Grosvenor's launch, our plan to become net zero business by 2030. So this was an excellent opportunity to not only convert an ugly building into something special, but also to develop the most sustainable office building that Grosvenor has ever delivered. On to the next slide. So this is a CGI of what we've now got planning to build. The existing 4th floor mansard comes off, and we provide 2 new floors, 4 and 5, with outdoor terracing at the 5th floor, which you can see sort of wrapped around the top, and then a new landscape terrace, which will take up the majority of the top 6th floor, which can be used by all of our tenants. In terms of the facade, the existing facade is maintained in the view of sort of keeping carbon to a minimum. The windows are replaced, but to break up that very heavy elevation that you saw earlier, we sort of punctured these sort of Juliet balconies over the reception with full height glass, and to the right of the next elevation adjacent, it just breaks up the elevation. The next slide is a different view, which shows the external green wall, which you can just about see wrapping down one side of the core. It's also on the other side, which you can't see. There's the terracing, which you can just about see up at the what must be the 5th floor level, and then landscaping, which we've now created down at street level. The next slide takes us inside to the reception. You'll remember earlier that it was a pretty pokey space, but now it's a new double height space. A lot of thought to materials, a green wall on both sides of the reception, a cork lining to the back wall, which I have to be honest, did take a little bit of persuasion to get through, but no, I think it's going to be great. It's a big contrast to what was there previously. The next slide shows another view of the reception, which looks back towards the main entrance, which now has so much more presence and focus from the street view with that double height aspect. Now, but the next slide, as I said earlier, this is going to be the most sustainable building that Grosvenor has delivered to date, and I just wanted to touch briefly on Grosvenor's green goals, which is very simply split into 4 areas. 1, 0 carbon. By 2030, we want to achieve net 0 carbon on our buildings. 2, 0 waste. We will ensure that there's 0 non-hazardous waste to landfill. 3, valuing nature, which effectively means a lot more greening to our developments than we've provided in the past. But it's valuable greening that's important rather than just a token gesture. And then 4th, bringing our partners with us, so that's working closely with our consultants, our contractors, to share ideas, learn from each other. We want to know about the emerging technologies out there, share with others, and that obviously includes other developers as well. The next slide shows how this project performs against our new targets. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but the targets are focused on 4 areas, which you can see down the left-hand side. So 1, operational energy. 2, embodied carbon. So that's the carbon used to create the new roof structure, for example. 3, nature, and 4, waste. The real challenge for developers is the embodied carbon, which you can see sort of midway down to the left there. Our 2021 target is 650 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared, and at Holborn Place we're forecasting 350 kilograms, which is a big dent in that target, which is great. So this leaves a residual 1,200 tonnes of carbon to offset, and at £20 a tonne, that leaves us with an offset payment of around 24k. I won't go through the other sustainability metrics, but as you can see from the target to the actual, we are in a very good place. So on the next slide, I wanted to focus on the project team. If you want to deliver a market-leading sustainable development, in my view, it's fundamental that the team are well briefed at the kick-off meeting. So at the very start, to leave it until midway through REBA 2 is just too late. And as you can see there, that's the team we've got on. So Bargazettas have done a great job of design. TFT have been leading us through the sustainability, and Hinckley Steel on the structure. So they've been doing a great job for us. So the next few slides set out how we're going to hit our green goals. In the interest of time, I'm just going to run through this quite quickly. Firstly, how we look to reduce operational energy. So we're looking at smart ventilation, openable windows, high efficiency lighting. This is going to be an all electric cooling solution, so no gas boilers. And then we're going to be working closely with our tenants to make sure that we're helping them to be as green as possible in terms of their fit out and the energy that they use going forward. And just as an aside, that image to the right there is a CGI of how one of the floors will look with a sort of timber ceiling. The next slide is embodied carbon. So this is where an awful lot of focus has been. The new 5th floor extension includes cross-laminated timber rather than steel, which I think would be typical for this type of building. And where we are having to provide steel, we are looking to reclaim steel from one of our other sites over at Bermondsey. So we're taking redundant steel at Bermondsey and we're looking to install it here on the upper new floors. Reclaimed raised floor tiles, reclaimed brickwork, yeah, and just a real focus on materials in every aspect of the building. Next slide is nature. I have to say I've touched on most of this already. It's mostly about greening, so we'll skip on to the next slide, which is waste. 2 points probably to pick out here. One is that 99% of strip out waste will be diverted from landfill. And then we expect to work with our contractors, to work with their suppliers to reduce packaging of materials coming to site and just generally to reduce the waste that comes out of the site activities. Next slide, in terms of innovation, we're using circadian lighting, which follows the patterns of natural daylight. It's not just the intensity of light, but it's also the colour of the light, which will change as the day progresses. Antibacterial air purifying tiles, air light paint. We're providing a living hoarding during the construction works, which you can see down at the bottom there. PVC-free scaffold wrap and mixed ventilation, which is just some of the highlights there. I'm very short of time, I know. So the next slide, leading benchmarks. What I'm going to say is that if you're working with any of these partners, you're likely to be delivering a sustainable building. Next slide, project is targeting BREEAM Outstanding, WELL Gold and WIRED Certified Gold, which takes us on to the last slide, which I won't go through, but this is just the way that we demonstrate within our business and to others outside. It's a graphical representation of the building, explaining where the green enhancements are. So Ben, that's me done.
Great, thank you very much, James. If anyone in the audience has questions for James or any of our speakers, please do put forward those questions through the Zoom Q&A function. I'm going to hand over now to Emily Sutton, who's Senior Facade Engineer at Arup, and she'll be presenting on 1 Finsbury Avenue. Emily, over to you.
Hello, just checking my screen works, and it does, brilliant. Oops. Okay, good morning, I'm Emily Sutton, a Senior Engineer in both the Facades and the Heritage team at Arup. Today I'll be speaking about Arup's work on the refurbishment of 1 Finsbury Avenue. 1 Finsbury Avenue was designed by Arup Associates and completed in 1984. It sets a standard for progressive office buildings in its meticulous planning and attention to detail. We have recently completed an award-winning scheme on the building, which I'll tell you a little bit about now. But before we do that, I think it's important to look back at the history and the context of the building. Oops. Oops, sorry, we're jumping a little bit. 1 Finsbury Avenue was the first phase of what would become Broadgate, a revolutionary speculative office development in the City of London. The mid-80s saw a huge change in the working practices in the City of London. Margaret Thatcher's deregulation of the financial markets led to an influx of American firms and a shift to electronic trading. And because of that, a trend for American-style shell and core offices. And 1 Finsbury Avenue was a very early example of this type. The shell and core approach allowed for large, minimally interrupted floor plates around a central core, a huge shift from past working practices, and a greater emphasis on the performance of the shell, the facade. And the facade at 1 Finsbury Avenue was a particularly high-spec part of the building. It made a real statement about the architectural expression of this new financial world. And for this reason, when the building was listed Grade 2 in 2015, Historic England placed particular emphasis on the facade, in fact, excluding much of the rest of the building. The facade was ahead of its time. To the outside, a distinctive shading system, a complex three-dimensional arrangement of cruciform aluminium struts and steel rods. And behind this is a thermally broken skin with double glazed units and insulated opaque panels. And behind this, supporting everything, is a frame of steel mullions and transoms. And amazingly, these elements are filled with water and form part of the heating system, freeing up floor space without the need for additional heating equipment, integrating the solar and thermal and heating into one highly engineered skin, exemplified Arup's integrated approach to architecture and engineering. The building's Grade 2 listing came at a time when large-scale refurbishment was being considered by the building's owner. They were keen to upgrade the building to meet the needs of commercial office spaces at present. And Arup led the scheme from RIBA stage 0 to 3, providing architecture, heritage, SMEP, facades and other services. And at stage 4, it's important to note that this moved on to AHMM, but still with the Arup multidisciplinary offering in tow. Before we came on at those early stages, there was an approach assumed from the outset of the scheme that the facade would be replaced in full. This is not an uncommon approach for modern buildings 30 years into the service life, but given that the building was listed and the client's assumptions was that the original details would need to be painstakingly remade as a part of the new facade with significantly higher performance, but we decided to propose a different approach. Generally, the structure aesthetics of the external envelope had been left untouched. Following initial condition assessments, we established it was also in generally good condition for its age. The high quality elements had stood the test of time. We then carried out a detailed significance and performance assessment, and the emphasis on the facade in the listing designation clearly suggests it's of high significance. However, rather than treat the facade as one entity, we introduced the idea of breaking it down into its smallest component parts and assessing the significance, performance, and other technical aspects of each component individually. And this exercise enabled us to identify which components might most easily be changed from a heritage perspective, while ensuring that the building's performance and efficiency were substantially improved. We identified 3 distinct layers in the facade build-up. An external layer consisting of shading system, caps, metal panels, and this provided much of the building's visual quality externally. It was highly engineered with high quality materials, and it all contributed to its look and feel. And then there's what we call the performance layer, consisting of glazing, insulation, and gaskets. For the glass, the bronze body tint was important, but the material itself was somewhat standard. This was determined as much lower contribution to the significance, and for the insulation and gaskets, which are barely visible, were considered not to contribute. An internal layer consisting of the heated framing, which was important for both the heritage and performance. And we studied the glazing and framing, looking at its thermal performance and air tightness of the original, and compared this to new glazing and new gaskets. We also established that the seal on the double glazed unit had not yet failed, and this meant that even the performance layer was not compromising operational use. Then the heating system. This appeared to be working well, but the condition internally was unknown. And through our assessments, we argued that the thin layer of original elements could be swapped out with maximum effect on the energy performance and a minimal impact on heritage. And this approach, this is the whole feel of the project, from a full replacement to retaining with minimal interventions. It's estimated that this decision saved our client several £1 million, and this marked a new approach in this refurbishment scheme. Now the approach had been determined, the project became about carrying out a series of small and sensitive interventions to reframe how the building interacted with its occupants, surrounding buildings, and public realm areas. And at this point, the refurbishment scheme was taken on by HMM, who transformed the internal spaces and shaped these interventions into the scheme you see today. One key change was the alterations to the ground floor, increasing transparency and improving public realm interaction with the new retail spaces. Another was lowering the thresholds on the terrace doors, allowing them to be accessed by occupants once again. To adapt the facade for installation of the doors, the sections of steel had to be cut out and new members added. A simple alteration typically, but when the facade includes an integrated heating system, it isn't quite as simple as it seems. Altering the framework meant that it needed to be drained and adapt that 30-year-old heating pipework. And we were unsure about the quality of the hidden internal surfaces and how would they respond if the pipes were emptied and potentially allowed to corrode even for a short period. These effects are difficult to predict and quantify, and with help from our materials specialists, we found a way to remove these members without permanently damaging these highly engineered original components. This was only possible after an extensive set of destructive and non-destructive tests, and also working closely with the contractor on the process. There was also the removal of the link bridge, which connected the building to its neighbour, 2 Finsbury Avenue. This was a later addition following the completion of 2 Finsbury Avenue in the 90s. And in this case, the task was actually to recreate the original facade, even if it was just over a very small area. This involved some in-depth detective work to establish what had been done when the link bridge was created. It turned out that the structural behaviour of the panels had been seriously compromised by the link bridge. We had to carefully jack the surrounding facade, floor by floor, to counteract some severe structural distortions. We needed to devise our own jacking system to get it just right. And finally, oops. Let's get back one. And finally, we managed to get the link bridge infilled and all the elements welded in place. So these are just 3 really small interventions, a bit of a taster of what we did, but perhaps we need a bit more time at some point. But I thought I'd just leave us with some departing thoughts on the flexibility of retrofits to listed commercial buildings, and in this case, when it's really focused around the facade components. I guess the key thing is there's no one perfect way to execute a refurbishment. And in the case of 1 Finsbury Avenue, to replace the whole facade to the quality and finesse of the original design would have been a huge and complex undertaking, not even considering the cost and carbon intensity to do so. However, the small yet intricate interventions were equally as challenging. And I guess at a time when sustainability needs to be central to all decision making, taking a pragmatic and considered approach to refurbishment in terms of heritage, performance and future use has to be the way forward. And I think this project is a testimony to that holistic collaboration between architect, heritage consultant and facade engineer to achieve just that. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Emily. Actually, back in October, we were over at 1FA doing the Kenneth Powell book launch, which I think is actually on the NLA website if anyone wants to have a look at the fantastic Morag Maiskopf inside of that building, which was a really fantastic event. Our final speaker today is going to be Peta Nichols, who's Associate Director at Buckley Gray Yeoman. Peta, over to you.
Hi, everyone. As has mentioned, I'm an Associate Director at Buckley Gray Yeoman. I'm going to talk to you today about YY London, which is a project in Canary Wharf. Next slide, please. This is YY London. It's currently under construction, is due for completion at the end of next year. It's circa 400,000 square foot NIA across 13 floors of office with 3 lower levels comprising office entrances, office amenity and retail spaces. A main focal point of the brief from the outset, even prior to COVID, has been putting an occupier's well-being at the forefront of our design decisions, to the point of the brand's tagline is now feel great, work well. In terms of sustainability credentials, beyond being a retrofit, YY has received BREEAM Outstanding New Construction 2018 for the design stage. It is designed to be WELL Platinum ready, and it is targeting net zero carbon in operation. Next slide, please. Prior to being YY, the building looked like this and was known as 30 South Colonnade. It is a first-generation Canary Wharf building. It was completed in 1989 and first occupied by London Underground and then Reuters in early 2000s. It's probably most known for its ticker tape. It was circa 300,000 square feet across 10 floors of office space, and the 3 lower levels comprised a small reception, retail units, and a lot of plant. Next slide, please. This photo is an example of the quality of the office space in the building, quite typical of its period. Okay floor to ceilings, but very little natural light. And the thing that strikes me most in my first site visit here was that due to the curved facade and very, very deep reveals, there was very little views out. Next slide, please. So taking a step back slightly, the first question we ask ourselves when we start a retrofit project is how much of that building do we unravel? And for this project, the base position in the first instance was not actually that much. Next slide, please. Although you would have gauged from the CGIs and this site photo taken last week that it actually ended up being most of it. In the end, we've essentially stripped back the building to structure and retained a few stairs and the loading bay. Next slide, please. So why? Today, we were asked the question about the challenges and opportunities of retrofitting a building to make offices that are fit for purpose today. This building was an office space, so the question I have then is how how have offices changed over the last 30 years? And what do we need to change older offices to make them not just fit for purpose for today, but best in class office spaces? The brief for YY was to make it best in class for the future office space, and not just judging it against a retrofit, but against new builds that were being built at the same time. So for YY, we established that was creating a new, much larger and more public reception space and public entrances at ground floor plane, a flexible floor plate that had provisions for increased occupancy, which required us to recore and resurface the building. We've got new tenant amenities throughout the building and a new facade. And to essentially pay for that, we've added about 25% more area. So starting with the area gained, we've been able to do that by reworking the floor plates and adding area to the sides, tops, and the central atrium of the building. Watermen have done an amazing job to facilitate this. It's mostly been achieved by reducing the live load allowances, which have been essentially cut in half, but still exceed current BCO recommendations, along with a reasonable amount of column, beam, and connection strengthening. The constraint for this particular project, however, was that we could not penetrate the lower slab, as there is water immediately below the building from the old docks. You'll notice some other quirks about this building because of it. For example, the lifts don't serve the lower ground floor level, which is a constraint when looking at redevelopment. Next slide, please. So moving on to the first of the things that we've done to rework YY to create a building of today was reworking the ground floor plane. The biggest move we did was relocating one of the entrances of the reception to the plaza level. Currently, the existing building was a fire escape. What we've done is created a triple height space that then creates a very large reception that links to retail areas to the north and west of the building and creates a public thoroughfare. Going back to the lifts not serving this level, we took that as an opportunity to mean that we didn't need security at this level and really wanted to encourage public to come into that space, unlike a lot of the Canary Wharf receptions around the area. In terms of a typical floor plate, on the left, we have the original floor plan of level 4, and on the right, a new floor plan with level 4. The brief was to create a flexible floor plate that would allow multiple tenancies per floor, unlike the original building, which would only allow one. What we've essentially done is we've retained the 2 western elevation stairs, but taken everything away from the western elevation and put it in the central to create a central core. This enabled us to get light through to the western elevation, particularly important because of the very deep floor plan. We've added an increased number of lifts and toilets to meet current BCO recommendations. Next slide, please. In terms of servicing, we worked with Hillsum Moran to create a completely new servicing strategy. The biggest constraint of this building was that although we had reasonable slab to slab heights, we had some very, very deep beams. And I think they must have gone through a very rigorous VE process during construction, because we have about 10 different beam types per floor and no typical beam floor plan, despite floors being repetitive across the floor building. So Hillsum Moran and our team worked very carefully to try and increase the floor to ceiling heights to achieve 2.9 meters while not intervening with the structure too much. Next slide, please. Lastly, other than the facade, there is a really key focus to put amenity into this building. So we've increased bikes, showers, and end of use facilities. And along with that, we've put outdoor space at the forefront of the design. We've carved NIA out of existing floor plans and to create terraces on most floors except for the top floor. And we've created a large roof terrace on the top. The large roof terrace also has a clubhouse that's going to be used for tenant amenities, so tenants can rent it out to have yoga classes, events, lectures, board meetings, and things like that. It also gave a large opportunity to green the space, so there's greening on every terrace, and we've worked with Townsend Associates to develop that design. Next slide, please. So lastly, replacing the facade, and I guess this was the most talked about decision during feasibility stage, whether or not we were going to do this. In the end, other than repositioning the building, it also gave us the opportunity to greatly improve the thermal performance of the building. And that was the decision that was taken. It gave us the, next slide, please. It also gave us the opportunity to significantly increase the natural light coming into the building, particularly important because of the deep floor plates that we've inherited. And it also gave us the ability to improve the sense of well-being. So going back to that image on the left of not being able to see out, now we've been able to see and appreciate the views from Canary Wharf and the lots of the green space and the water that's there. Next slide, please. So I've included this last slide as an update as to what happened to the old facade. Throughout from the start of this project, when we decided that we wanted to replace the facade, we really wanted to reuse the facade on site. Unfortunately, because of the way the facade was constructed, which is 40 mils of stone fixed to a precast concrete cladding system, is incredibly hard to find a supplier and manufacturer that would be able to recycle it. So I guess the lesson learned here for us, taken from this, has been about designing buildings with the ability to dismantle and readily separate materials. So taking that forward, at YY, everything that we're putting back in, we're really considering the end use and cradle to cradle opportunities for recycling. Next slide, please. So going back to how much we unravel and at what point does a retrofit become a new build? So I guess by maintaining the building structure, we've been able to save 10,260 tonnes of CO2 into the environment, which is equivalent to about 7,600 flights to Sydney. We'd have required to plant 51,300 trees required to offset that energy, or for the tea drinkers in here, 798 million cups of tea. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Peter. They were fantastic stats to finish on. Now, we will be making those presentations available to our members. So if you did want to see any of those, please do look out for those on our website. We've got a little bit of time now for questions from the audience. So please do ask questions if you haven't already. I'm going to kick off with a question that was actually laid out for James, but I think I'm going to open it up to all of you. The question was, how was your experience working with the local planning authority to obtain planning permission? And then for James specifically, was the LPA enthusiastic about the environmental credentials of the building, and did you find that this smoothed your way through planning at all?
I mean, I'm happy to start with that one, Ben.
Yeah.
I mean, the answer to that question is that yes. I mean, if we're talking to any planning authority, that they are keen to hear about our plans in terms of sustainability, but equally that doesn't mean that we have an easier ride to get through the process, because the usual restrictions of rights of light and that the usual planning constraints clearly will still apply, but yes, the credentials on this particular project, the local authority were very much behind what we were looking to achieve.
Great. And would anyone else like to pick up on the relationship with the local authority? Seth.
I mean, in some ways, when we got planning for Great Suffolk Street, it was before this sort of tipping point, really. I mean, it's crazy, really. We've been talking about sustainability and with some earnestness for about 30 years, you know, since. But it feels almost too recent, really. I think our conversation with Southwark Council would be very different now to what it would have been, I guess, 5 years ago. But the relationship was very good. But I mean, I think, you know, in terms of sustainability, we'd be having a different conversation, I think, and there would be more exacting on the building performance. As it was, Morgan Capital Partners wanted to go for BREEAM Excellent, etc. We were inherently reusing an existing building, you know, so therefore that was sustainable. But I mean, the point I would like to make was that Southwark were very good in terms of the material choice, etc. It was a very collaborative exercise, but I guess the theme of this discussion is probably more about sustainability, so probably should stay on message.
Definitely. Val, Peter, Emily, anything on that before we move on?
Very quickly, for YY, Tower Hamlets were absolutely amazing. I think we ended up getting approval under delegated powers, didn't need to go to committee. I think we ended up with one pre-app in terms of presenting our approach in terms of massing and connecting to public, and then one pre-app about design, and that was it. And they were amazingly positive about creating a new generation for Canary Wharf, I guess.
Great. We've had a really, Val, did you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, but in retaining existing structure, that's the first step forward for a sustainable approach. That's for sure. So whether it's historical or is it retrofit or with slightly later buildings, but retaining should be always the first step, because from a CO2 carbon emissions, it is certainly the best way forward.
That's a really great question. It's come through probably an entire event by itself, but the question is: principal argument for refurbished offices cannot provide grade A BCO compliant offices, ceiling heights cause narrow floor plate, and need for net zero building. How can planners respond to these arguments? Who wants to tackle that one? No one.
Yeah, I mean, I probably can't sort of give direct anecdotes really, because it's from a privileged sort of planning pre-application process. But we had one authority who was interrogating our client and my wife's team on a large industrial retrofit about glazing. And, you know, the planners were actually asking for more glass, and the client had to explain that, you know, we don't put as much glass into buildings now because we have to really address the energy balance and really balance the needs of daylight with overheating, especially in offices. So I think planners perhaps need to understand that the way building physics is addressed is sort of, you know, a bit more, you know, the glass building is perhaps less common now, I might say.
Sure.
So they need to catch up on that front, I think.
Anyone else have a comment on that? And then I've got a question that I'd like everyone to answer, just to finish on.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a sort of point for me on that. Obviously, insulation of walls, which I think someone else has raised, is an issue, because when you insulate walls, you are affecting NIA, so there is that balance there. So to answer, I think, that question on this particular project and other projects at Grosvenor, yes, excuse me, we do look to insulate walls in our projects, and aerogel is a product that we have used on some buildings, and I think we're using it on this one, which gives you the insulation that you need, but you're limiting the impact on the NIA. So it's about it's thinking creatively, and I mentioned emerging technologies on our projects, and that's where we need to focus, because you need to find these emerging technologies to deliver sustainably, but also give tenants the buildings that they want.
Great, thanks, James. Okay, I'm going to finish on a really quick question. I'm going to come to you, Emily, first on this one, but it's really around, you know, the way we work has dramatically changed even in the last sort of 10 to 15 years. Certainly in the last year, obviously everything is, you know, everything has changed. How can we ensure that the buildings that we're retrofitting now are actually fit for purpose in 30 years, or when they may need to be retrofitted again? What are the kind of key things that we can do to ensure that they are fit for the future? And I'll come to you first, Emily.
Thanks. I guess Finsbury Avenue is a really kind of poignant example here then, and the kind of the internal flexibility really left it open to be adapted, and it's been adapted many times through its lifespan. That the atrium's been infilled, floors added, etc., etc. And so that internal flexibility is such a huge thing. But stripping back to then kind of the shell side of it and the facade, and I think Peter kind of touched on a bit about this of how do we design for deconstruction now to really help ourselves in the future. So I think it's going to be a massive thing. And so having that and being mindful of that with any intervention we make, whether that's on a new build or even just adapting the existing, is really key to me.
Great, thank you. I'll come to Seth next.
Okay. You know, in some ways, the Great Suffolk Street project, you know, isn't a sort of full whistles and bells, you know, sort of passive house, for example, type of refurbishment. But what it is doing is reusing a building that's a century old. And, you know, in some ways, Morgan Capital Partners are almost the custodians of the building for a time, a generation. And then hopefully the building will have another 100 years. So, you know, what drove our material choice? Actually, you know, we thought about longevity, resilience, and okay, you know, maybe using bricks or terrazzo. They don't sound like sustainable materials. But when you think they can just sit there for a century, and if you think that an internal tenancy, you know, you release a building on a 10-year tenancy with a 5-year break, for example, well, that means all the interiors are going to be ripped out every 10 years. I mean, that's kind of, so in some ways, by making the most resilient shell using brick instead of plasterboard, actually you're sort of just keeping that carbon inside the building, and it's not going into a skip in 10 years. And so it's really about resilience and longevity and being custodians of a structure that hopefully will outlive us again. So thank you.
Right. Thank you. Peter, I'll come to you.
I think, yeah, touching back on my last slide, basically about being really conscious about what we're putting into the building in terms of thinking about that it may be destructed in 30 years and making it have the ability to be recycled readily. And again, so I think that's what we've challenged ourselves to do in this building. And again, flexibility in the floor plates and the design. So ensuring that tenants can do what they want onto it. It will be changed in the future, and not expecting us to design something that will stay forever, but it won't be. So being conscious of that now rather than thinking about it later.
Great, thank you. James.
I mean, I agree with Seth's point about, you know, you need to build buildings to last. Grosvenor has a very long-term view in terms of the way we develop and build. And it's about thinking carefully about the products that you use, and also thinking smart as well. So with Holbein Place, it was a building that cried out for a new facade, frankly. And we did look at an assessment of just taking that brick facade off, going back to something that was completely different. But the embodied carbon to replace that facade with new was significantly higher. And that's how we've been able to get the carbon score down very low. So yeah, it's just thinking smart.
Great, thanks, James. And Valentina, finally you.
So for me, it's all about building into the retrofit adaptability and flexibility, and being able to allow, at least from a structural point of view, building potential some redundancy. Existing building tends to have some redundancy in itself, and that generally helps. We found that we could actually had 11-story onto a already tall tower, South Bank, just looking at the behavior. And we have now extended the life of that particular building for another 100 years. Whether we could have had an additional 11 within, maybe, or maybe not, but certainly we are extending the life of existing building rather than taking them down and building something new. So the stock out there, it's immense. And we're just going to link back to the previous question about BCO compliance. Do we need to be BCO compliance? Not necessarily. There are new buildings. I mean, White Collar Factory is an example, is not compliance with BCO on certain aspects. So floor to floor, as long as the clients are happy and we manage expectations, that is. So we might want to go back to the agents, for example, and sort of re-looking at, because they are the ones sort of driving the seat and certain decision making. So that's it, controversial.
Great, thank you, Valentina. I want to thank you all for coming today. Really great presentations. Like I say, we'll make those available to the audience. Sorry, we ran a little bit over, but I didn't want to cut anyone off because I think it's a really interesting discussion. I want to thank our programme supporters, Purcell, and for all of you for joining us, and hopefully see you at our next events. Right, thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.